Marcus Thompson had always been a dreamer. At 32, he worked as a carpenter in the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana, but his heart belonged to the rolling hills and vast skies of the western frontier. Every evening after work, he would drive his old pickup truck through the countryside, imagining what it would be like to own a piece of that endless landscape. It was on one of these drives that Marcus first spotted the old barn. Sitting alone on a 10-acre plot, the weathered structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, and several boards hung loose from its sides. But something about the barn called to Marcus. Maybe it was the way the setting sun cast long shadows across its weathered walls. Or perhaps it was the wild roses that had grown up around its foundation. Marcus pulled over and walked closer to get a better look. The property had a small farmhouse about 50 yards from the barn, but it too looked abandoned. Windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Still, Marcus could see potential in both buildings. With some work, this could be the perfect place to start his dream of country living. The next day, Marcus visited the county courthouse to find out who owned the property. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, pulled out dusty files and explained that the land belonged to the estate of someone named Ezra Blackwood. Ezra had died 3 years earlier with no living relatives. The county had been trying to sell the property ever since. "Nobody wants it," Mrs. Patterson said with a shrug. "It's too far from town for most folks, and that old barn is practically falling down. The county just wants to get rid of it at this point." Marcus asked about the price. Expecting to hear a number well beyond his modest savings, Mrs. Patterson looked through more papers. Before finding what she was looking for, "Well, she said, adjusting her glasses. "Looks like they've dropped the price to just $1. Can you believe that? $1 for 10 acres and 2 buildings. Marcus thought he had misheard. $1? Are you sure? Mrs. Patterson double-checked the paperwork. That's right. The county commissioners voted last month to practically give it away. They're tired of paying property taxes on land that nobody wants. Marcus could hardly contain his excitement. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire life. He immediately filled out the paperwork and handed over a single dollar bill. Within an hour, he was the proud owner of 10 acres of Montana countryside. That weekend, Marcus drove out to his new property with his toolbox and a cooler full of sandwiches. He planned to spend the day exploring both buildings and making a list of necessary repairs. The farmhouse would need extensive work, but Marcus figured he could live in town while slowly renovating it on weekends. The barn, however, was his first priority. Marcus had always wanted to restore an old barn, and this one had good bones, despite its rough exterior. He walked around the perimeter, noting which boards needed replacement and where the roof might be leaking. The large front doors were held shut by a rusty chain and an old padlock. Marcus tried several keys he found hanging on a nail near the door, but none of them worked. Finally, he used bolt cutters from his toolbox to break the chain. The doors creaked loudly as Marcus pulled them open, and sunlight streamed into the dusty interior. The barn was bigger inside than it had appeared from the outside, with a high ceiling supported by massive wooden beams. Old farm equipment sat covered in dust and cobwebs, a rusty plow, some hand tools, and what looked like the remains of an old wagon. Marcus spent the morning cleaning and organizing, moving the old equipment to one side and sweeping years of accumulated dirt and debris. The work was dusty and tiring, but he loved every minute of it. This barn would be his workshop, a place where he could pursue his woodworking hobby and maybe even start a small furniture-making business. It was while moving a heavy workbench that Marcus first noticed something odd about the barn floor. In one corner, several floorboards seemed newer than the rest, as if they had been replaced at some point. The wood was a slightly different color, and the nails looked more recent. Curious, Marcus examined the boards more closely. They definitely didn't match the rest of the floor, and when he stepped on them, they felt slightly uneven. He wondered if there might be some kind of storage space underneath, or maybe even a root cellar. Marcus went back to his truck to get a crowbar. If there was indeed something beneath those floorboards, he wanted to know what it was. Perhaps the previous owner had hidden something valuable down there. Or maybe it was just an old storage space for tools or supplies. The floorboards came up easier than Marcus expected, revealing a dark opening below. The smell that rose from the hole was musty and damp, like earth that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Marcus got a flashlight from his toolbox and shone it down into the opening. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Below the barn was a basement room, carved directly into the earth and lined with stone walls. But it wasn't the basement itself that shocked Marcus. It was what he could see hanging from the walls in the beam of his flashlight. Heavy iron chains hung from metal rings that had been driven deep into the stone walls. The chains were old and rusted, but they looked incredibly strong, as if they had been designed to hold something or someone securely. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into that dark basement. What had gone on down there? Why would anyone need chains like that in a basement under a barn? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. He knew he should go down and investigate further. But something about those chains filled him with dread. Marcus had bought this property thinking he was getting the deal of a lifetime. Now he was beginning to wonder if there might be a very dark reason why the county had been so eager to sell it for just $1. Marcus stood at the edge of the dark opening, his flashlight beam dancing across those menacing iron chains. Every instinct told him to replace the floorboards and pretend he had never found this basement. But curiosity proved stronger than fear, and after several minutes of hesitation, he lowered himself down into the underground chamber. The basement was larger than he had expected. Roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for Marcus to stand upright. The stone walls were smooth and expertly fitted, suggesting this space had been carefully constructed rather than hastily dug. The floor was hard-packed earth, and the air smelled of moisture and something else Marcus couldn't identify. His flashlight revealed more details that made his stomach turn. The chains weren't just hanging randomly, they were positioned at specific intervals along the walls, each one ending in heavy iron shackles. Some of the shackles showed signs of wear, as if they had been used repeatedly over many years. In one corner of the basement, Marcus found a wooden table covered with what appeared to be old leather straps and more chains. On the table's surface, deep gouges in the wood suggested it had seen violent use. Marcus began to understand that this wasn't just a storage basement, it was some kind of prison or torture chamber. But who had built this place, and why? Marcus thought about Ezra Blackwood, the previous owner, who had died 3 years earlier. Had Ezra known about this basement? Had he been the one using it, or had it existed long before he bought the property? Marcus climbed back up into the barn, his hands shaking slightly as he replaced the floorboards. He needed answers. He knew exactly where to start looking. Mrs. Patterson at the courthouse had mentioned that the property had a history dating back over 100 years. If there were dark secrets buried here, someone in town might know about them. The next morning, Marcus visited the Cedar Falls Historical Society, a small building that served as both museum and archive for local history. The society was run by Eleanor Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher who knew more about the area's past than anyone else alive. Eleanor was delighted to have a visitor. Most people in Cedar Falls were too busy with their modern lives to care about local history, so she rarely had anyone to share her vast knowledge with. When Marcus explained that he had bought the old Blackwood property, Eleanor's expression immediately became serious. "Oh my," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You bought that place? I'm surprised the county was able to find anyone willing to take it, even at that price." Marcus felt his heart sink. "Why? What's wrong with it?" Eleanor led him to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder marked Blackwood Property Historical Records. She spread several old photographs and documents across her desk, each one telling part of a disturbing story. "That land has a dark history," Eleanor explained. "The original owner was a man named Silas Blackwood, Ezra's great-grandfather. Silas came to Montana in 1887, claiming to be a cattle rancher. But the locals quickly realized something wasn't right about him. The photographs Eleanor showed Marcus were from the early 1900s. They depicted the barn and farmhouse in their prime. But even in those old images, something about the property felt ominous. The barn looked exactly the same as it did now, which meant the basement had likely been there for over a century. What did Silas do? Marcus asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, Eleanor pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1903. The headline read, "Local rancher suspected in missing persons cases." The article described how several drifters and traveling workers had disappeared after being hired to work on Silas Blackwood's ranch. Families had come looking for their missing relatives. But Silas always claimed the men had simply moved on to other jobs. The sheriff back then was Silas's brother. LAUS continued. So the investigations never went anywhere. But people talked. They said strange sounds came from that property at night, screaming and crying that would go on for hours. Marcus felt sick as he read through more documents. There were reports of neighbors finding pieces of clothing and personal belongings scattered in the woods near the Blackwood property. A diary entry from a local woman described seeing Silas leading chained men into his barn late at night. What happened to Silas? Marcus asked. Eleanor showed him another newspaper clipping. This one from 1904. Silas Blackwood had been found dead in his barn, apparently killed by a group of his victims who had somehow escaped their chains. The article mentioned that when authorities finally searched the property thoroughly, they found evidence of torture and murder, but many details were kept from the public. The property passed to Silas's son, then to his grandson, and finally to Ezra, Eleanor explained. None of them ever lived there permanently. They all seemed afraid of the place, but they couldn't bring themselves to sell it either. Family shame, I suppose. Marcus learned that over the decades, several other people had tried to buy or rent the property. A family in the 1940s lasted only 3 months before fleeing in the middle of the night, claiming they heard screaming from the barn. In the 1970s, a hippie commune tried to use the land for organic farming but abandoned it after several members reported seeing ghostly figures near the barn. Ezra was the last of the Blackwood line, Eleanor said. When he died, the property finally ended up with the county. I think the commissioners were just hoping someone would buy it and tear everything down. As Marcus drove home that evening, his mind raced with everything he had learned. The basement under his barn had been used for torture and murder over a century ago. Those chains had held innocent people who had died horrible deaths in that underground chamber. But Marcus was a practical man, not given to believing in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. What had happened in that basement was terrible, but it was also ancient history. Silas Blackwood was long dead, and Marcus had no intention of continuing his horrific legacy. Still, as he lay in bed that night, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about those chains. In his dreams, he heard the rattling of iron links and the distant sound of screaming echoing from somewhere deep underground. When he woke in the morning, Marcus had made a decision. He would seal up that basement permanently and never speak of it again. What Marcus didn't know was that his discovery of the basement had awakened something that had been dormant for many years. That very night, as he slept peacefully in his apartment in town, strange lights flickered in the windows of the old farmhouse. The sound of dragging chains echoed through the empty rooms of his barn. Marcus returned to his property the following Saturday morning, armed with concrete mics, lumber, and steel plates. His plan was simple: seal the basement permanently and transform the barn into the workshop he had originally envisioned. The dark history would stay buried where it belonged. As he pulled up to the barn, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. The large front doors, which he had carefully closed and secured the previous weekend, now stood slightly open. The new chain he had installed hung broken on the ground, its links twisted as if something incredibly strong had snapped them apart. Marcus examined the broken chain more closely. The metal hadn't been cut. It looked like it had been stretched and torn by brute force. But that seemed impossible. The chain was heavy-duty steel, rated to hold several thousand pounds. What could have possibly broken it like this? Inside the barn, Marcus discovered more disturbing changes. The old farm equipment he had carefully organized along the walls had been scattered across the floor. The workbench he had moved sat in the center of the barn, directly over where the basement entrance lay hidden beneath the floorboards. Most unsettling of all, the floorboards covering the basement entrance were no longer flush with the rest of the floor. They sat slightly raised, as if something underneath had been pushing up against them. Marcus tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe the wood had expanded due to moisture from the basement. Perhaps animals had gotten into the barn and moved things around. But deep down, he knew these explanations didn't make sense. Despite his growing unease, Marcus began mixing concrete. He pried up the floorboards once more, planning to fill the basement entirely with concrete and steel reinforcement. As the opening revealed itself, that familiar musty smell rose up. But now it carried something else, a metallic scent that reminded Marcus of old blood. He shone his flashlight down into the basement and immediately knew something had changed. The chains that had hung motionless from the walls were now swaying gently, as if they had recently been disturbed. Some of the shackles lay open on the floor, their heavy metal clasps somehow unlatched. Marcus's hands trembled as he held the flashlight. There was no wind in the basement, nothing that could explain why those chains were moving, and how had the shackles opened themselves? They had been securely locked when he first discovered them. A sound from deep in the basement made Marcus freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the slow scraping of metal against stone. One of the chains was dragging across the basement floor. Pulled by some invisible force, Marcus slammed the floorboards back into place and began nailing them down with desperate urgency. Whatever was happening in that basement, he wanted no part of it. As he hammered, he could hear more sounds from below, chains rattling, something heavy being dragged across the floor, and what sounded almost like whispered voices by afternoon. Marcus had the basement sealed with multiple layers of boards, steel plates, and finally, a thick coating of concrete. The surface was smooth and level, indistinguishable from the rest of the barn floor. No one would ever know there had been an opening there. But as Marcus packed up his tools, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Despite all his work, despite the tons of concrete and steel now covering the basement entrance, he could still hear faint sounds from below. The concrete was somehow not blocking the noise. He could clearly make out the grinding of chains and what sounded like footsteps moving back and forth in the sealed chamber. Marcus left the barn quickly, telling himself the sounds were just his imagination. Old buildings made noise, pipes settling, wood expanding and contracting. There had to be a logical explanation. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into renovating the farmhouse, trying to forget about the barn and its buried secrets. The house needed new windows, extensive electrical work, and a completely rebuilt kitchen. Marcus figured if he stayed busy enough, he could avoid thinking about what lay beneath his barn floor, but the barn wouldn't let itself be ignored. Every evening when Marcus finished work on the house, he would notice strange things about the barn. Lights seemed to flicker in its windows, even though there was no electricity running to the building. The doors, no matter how securely Marcus locked them, were always found open the next morning. Most disturbing were the sounds. Marcus could hear them clearly from the farmhouse, especially at night. The rattling of chains echoed across the property, accompanied by what sounded like moaning and crying. Sometimes Marcus thought he could make out actual words, pleas for help, cries of pain, and angry threats spoken in voices that seemed to come from another century. Marcus began staying in town during the evenings, returning to the property only during daylight hours. But even his neighbors in Cedar Falls started asking questions. People driving past the Blackwood property reported seeing strange lights and hearing disturbing noises. The sheriff received several calls about possible intruders on Marcus's land. When Sheriff Davidson visited to investigate, Marcus tried to downplay the situation. He claimed the sounds were probably just whined through the old barn boards, and the lights might be reflections from passing cars. Sheriff Davidson seemed skeptical, but had no evidence of any actual wrongdoing. Just be careful out there, Marcus, the sheriff warned as he prepared to leave. That property has a bad reputation for good reason. Maybe you should consider tearing down that old barn. After the sheriff left, Marcus sat alone in his farmhouse, listening to the sounds coming from the sealed basement beneath his barn. The concrete and steel barriers he had installed were doing nothing to contain whatever was down there. If anything, the sounds were getting louder and more frequent. Marcus realized he needed help, but who would believe his story? He had sealed a basement full of torture equipment, and now ghostly voices were echoing from beneath tons of concrete. It sounded insane even to him. That night, as Marcus tried to sleep in the renovated farmhouse, the sounds from the barn reached a crescendo. He could hear multiple voices now, men crying out in pain, screaming for mercy, begging to be released. The rattling of chains was so loud it seemed to shake the entire property. Marcus covered his head with pillows, but the sounds penetrated everything. They weren't just noises anymore. They were the voices of Silas Blackwood's victims. Still trapped in that underground chamber, after more than a century, and Marcus's concrete seal hadn't buried them. It had awakened them. As dawn broke over the Montana countryside, an eerie silence finally settled over the property. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Whatever spirits haunted that basement had been disturbed by his discovery, and they wouldn't rest until they found a way out. Marcus knew he couldn't handle this situation alone. The supernatural events at his property were escalating beyond anything he could rationalize or ignore. After 3 sleepless nights, listening to the tormented voices echoing from his sealed basement, he made a decision that went against every practical instinct he possessed. He needed to find someone who understood the paranormal, someone who could help him deal with whatever spirits were. Trapped beneath his barn, Marcus spent the morning searching online and making phone calls, eventually finding contact information for Dr. Sarah Medina, a paranormal investigator and professor of folklore at the State University. Dr. Medina had spent 15 years studying supernatural phenomena across the American West. When Marcus called and briefly explained his situation, she immediately became interested. Stories of haunted properties with violent histories were her specialty, and the Blackwood case sounded particularly compelling. "I can be there tomorrow morning," Dr. Medina told Marcus over the phone. "But I want to warn you, if what you're describing is real, simply sealing the basement may have made things worse. Trapped spirits often become more agitated when their physical anchor points are disturbed." Dr. Medina arrived at the property the next day in a van loaded with electronic equipment. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the barn and farmhouse. Her assistant, a young graduate student named Jake Mitchell, helped her unload sensitive recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, and thermal imaging cameras. "Tell me exactly what you found in that basement," Dr. Medina said, as they walked toward the barn. Marcus described the chains, shackles, and torture equipment in detail, as well as the historical information Eleanor Whitfield had shared with him. Dr. Medina nodded thoughtfully. "Silas Blackwood. I've heard that name before in my research. He was part of a network of criminals who preyed on travelers and migrant workers in the late 1800s. Men like him often bound the spirits of their victims to the locations where they died violently." Inside the barn, Dr. Medina immediately began taking readings with her equipment. The electromagnetic field detectors went crazy near the sealed basement area, registering energy patterns that defied normal explanation. The thermal cameras showed cold spots that moved across the concrete floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "There's definitely something here," Dr. Medina confirmed. "The energy readings are off the charts. The temperature variations suggest multiple entities moving around beneath that concrete, as if responding to her words." A loud crash echoed from below the barn floor. The concrete surface that Marcus had thought was permanently sealed began to crack. Hairline fractures spreading outward from the center, where the basement entrance had been. Jake set up audio recording equipment while Dr. Medina prepared what she called a communication array, a combination of electronic and traditional tools designed to facilitate contact with spirits. She explained to Marcus that sometimes the only way to help trapped souls was to understand what they needed to find peace. I want to try making contact," Dr. Medina said. "These spirits have been trying to communicate with you, Marcus. They're not necessarily hostile. They may just be desperate to tell their story." As evening fell, Dr. Medina began her attempt at communication. She spoke aloud to the basement, asking the spirits to make their presence known in a controlled way. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The cracks in the concrete floor widened visibly, A low moaning sound rose from below. The electromagnetic detectors registered massive energy spikes, and the temperature in the barn dropped by 20 degrees in just a few minutes. "We hear you, Dr. Medina," said calmly. "We know what happened to you. Tell us what you need." The response came not as words but as images that it somehow appeared directly in the minds of everyone present. Marcus saw flashes of Silas Blackwood's crimes, innocent men being lured to the property, chained in the basement, tortured for days before being murdered. He witnessed the fear and suffering of dozens of victims over many years, but mixed with these horrific images were glimpses of something else, a woman. She appeared to be in her 30s, with long dark hair and eyes full of compassion. Marcus could see her moving through the basement, bringing water to the prisoners, trying to ease their suffering when Silas wasn't watching. "Who is she?" Marcus asked, though he somehow already knew the answer. Dr. Medina was studying the readings on her equipment, her face pale with concentration. "I believe that's Clara Blackwood, Silas's wife. According to historical records, she disappeared mysteriously in 1903, just before Silas was killed. People assumed she had run away, but the temperature in the barn dropped even further, and frost began forming on the metal surfaces of the old farm equipment. Through the recording devices, they could now hear clear voices speaking from the basement, not the anguished cries Marcus had been hearing, but actual conversation. "She tried to help us," a man's voice said, distorted but understandable. "Clara brought us food, medicine. She wanted to free us, but she was afraid of what he would do." Another voice joined in. "He found out about her helping us. Killed her right there in the basement, then sealed her body in the walls. She's been trapped down there with us all these years." Dr. Medina exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus. "That changes everything. Clara isn't just witnessing what happened, she's trapped there too, trying to help the other spirits find peace. But she can't do it alone." The concrete floor was now cracked completely through, chunks of it beginning to crumble and fall into the basement below. Through the gaps, Marcus could see a faint, ethereal light emanating from the underground chamber. "What do they want from me?" Marcus asked. Dr. Medina consulted her equipment readings and considered the spiritual communications they had received. "I think they want Clara's body to be properly buried. And they want their own stories to be told. These men disappeared without anyone ever knowing what happened to them. Their families never had closure." As if confirming her interpretation, the voices from the basement became more insistent. They began sharing their names: James Morton, a traveling blacksmith from Ohio; Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant heading to California; Miguel Santos, a cowboy from Texas. Dozens of names, each representing a life cut short by Silas Blackwood's cruelty. They want to be remembered, Marcus realized. They want people to know they existed, that they mattered. Dr. Medina nodded. "And Clara wants to finally complete her mission of helping them. But first, we need to find her remains and give her a proper burial. Only then can she guide the other spirits to their rest." The concrete floor continued to crumble, revealing more of the basement below. Marcus could now see the original stone walls and the iron chains that had held so many innocent people. But there was something else down there now, a warm, golden light that seemed to pulse with life and hope. Marcus looked at Dr. Medina and Jake, then down at the opening basement. He knew what needed to be done. Despite every fear and rational objection in his mind, he would have to go back down into that chamber of horrors. But this time, he wouldn't be going alone, and he wouldn't be running from the truth. This time, he was going to help set things right. With Dr. Medina's equipment providing light, Marcus descended into the basement for the second time. Everything had changed since his first visit. The oppressive dread was replaced by anticipation, as if trapped spirits were finally seeing hope after more than a century of darkness. Golden light emanated from Clara, Blackwood's spirit. She appeared as a translucent woman in period dress, her face filled with sadness and compassion. She gestured toward a stone wall section that looked different from the rest. Dr. Medina ran her hands along the wall where Clara pointed. "Here," she said, finding newer, discolored mortar. "This part was built after the rest." Jake handed down tools, and Marcus began removing stones from the indicated section. The work was slow and reverent, They understood they were uncovering remains of someone who had tried to save innocent lives. Behind the false wall, they found a small alcove containing human remains wrapped in what had once been a white dress. Fabric traces remained after all these years. Beside the bones lay a small leather journal. Preserved in the dry conditions, Dr. Medina handled the journal carefully, opening it to reveal elegant handwriting. She read selected passages aloud. "I cannot stop what Silas does, but I can ease their suffering. I bring them water when he is away, clean their wounds when possible. God, forgive my cowardice. I should find a way to free them all." Another entry. Dated days before Clara's disappearance. "He suspects what I have been doing. I see it in his eyes. I have hidden this journal where he will never find it, along with the names of all his victims. Someone must remember these poor souls." The journal's final pages contained exactly what Clara promised: detailed names, ages, and backgrounds of Silas Blackwood's victims. James Morton, the blacksmith, had been traveling to Montana to start fresh after his wife died in childbirth. Robert Chen was sending money to family in China. Miguel Santos, only 19, worked cattle drives saving for his own ranch. Each name represented a complete human story cut tragically short. Families left wondering what happened to missing loved ones. Clara had meticulously recorded everything she learned about each man, creating a memorial that waited over 100 years to be discovered, as Dr. Medina read names aloud. Something remarkable happened. The unnaturally cold temperature gradually warmed. The oppressive weight pressing down on the chamber began lifting. One by one, translucent figures appeared throughout the basement, spirits of Silas's victims. Finally able to manifest clearly now that their stories were being told. Marcus watched, amazed as these ghostly men smiled and nodded thanks. Some reached out to touch Clara's spirit, expressing gratitude impossible to communicate for over a century. There were tears, embraces, words of forgiveness spoken in distant voices. "Thank you," James Morton's spirit said directly to Marcus. "Thank you for finding her, for finding us. We've been waiting so long." But even as this incredible scene unfolded, Marcus noticed the spirits weren't disappearing. Clara's spirit approached Dr. Medina and gestured urgently toward the journal, then pointed upward toward the barn. "She wants something more," Dr. Medina interpreted. "Finding her body and telling their stories is just the first step." Clara's spirit moved to the stone wall, pointing to specific locations. As Marcus and Dr. Medina examined these spots, they realized Clara was indicating where other remains were hidden. Silas hadn't just killed his victims, he had buried them in the torture chamber walls. The horrible truth became clear. The basement wasn't just a prison, it was also a tomb. Bodies of dozens of murdered men were entombed within these stone walls, their remains never properly laid to rest. Clara had witnessed every death, remembered every burial site, waited over a century for someone to give these victims deserved dignity. Marcus felt overwhelmed by what Clara was asking. "We can't excavate this entire basement ourselves. This requires authorities, proper archaeological methods, coroner involvement. ... Double quotes. Dr. Medina nodded grimly. "She's right, though. These men deserve proper burials. Their families deserve to know what happened, even after all these years. Some families might still exist, descendants who have wondered about missing ancestors." Clara's spirit approached Marcus directly, her ethereal hand conveying warmth as she placed it on his shoulder. In that moment, Marcus understood something profound. He hadn't bought this property by accident. The dollar price, the county's eagerness to sell, his immediate attraction to the barn, it had all been orchestrated by forces beyond understanding. Clara had been waiting for someone with the right combination of compassion and determination to uncover the truth. "She guided you here," Dr. Medina said, reaching the same realization. "The spirits have been waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would care enough to see this through properly." The other spirits gathered around Marcus, their faces filled with hope. These weren't frightening ghosts anymore, they were souls who had suffered terribly, but were now on the verge of finding peace. Denied them for so long. Marcus looked around the basement, mentally calculating the enormous task ahead. He would need to contact law enforcement, historians, genealogists, and probably federal authorities. The excavation and identification process could take months or years. The property would be swarmed with investigators, archaeologists, and media attention. But as he looked at Clara's spirit and the faces of all the men who had died in this horrible place, Marcus knew he had no choice. This was bigger than his dreams of country living or workshop plans. This was about justice, remembrance, finally giving these victims the dignity they had been denied. "We'll do it," Marcus said aloud. Addressing both living people in the basement and surrounding spirits, "We'll make sure everyone knows what happened here, and we'll make sure you all get proper burials." The moment Marcus spoke those words, the entire basement filled with golden light. The spirits began to fade, but their expressions were peaceful now instead of tormented. Clara's spirit lingered longest, her translucent form becoming brighter and more beautiful as she prepared to move on. She looked directly at Marcus one final time, and he heard her voice clearly in his mind. "Thank you for giving us back our names. Thank you for remembering us," as golden light intensified. All spirits slowly dissolved into particles of warm, shimmering energy that rose upward through the barn floor and disappeared into the night sky above. For the first time since Marcus discovered the basement, the underground chamber felt truly empty, not with oppressive emptiness of trapped souls, but with peaceful quiet of a burden finally lifted. Dr. Medina carefully packed Clara's remains and the precious journal into protective containers. Jake documented everything with photographs and detailed measurements. They had found something that would rewrite the American West's historical record and provide closure for families who had wondered for generations about missing ancestors as they climbed back into the barn. Marcus felt a profound shift in his property's atmosphere. The barn no longer felt haunted or threatening. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, just an old building waiting for new purpose. The oppressive weight that had hung over the land for over a century had finally lifted. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as they loaded Dr. Medina's equipment back into her van. "Now we contact authorities," she replied. "This will become a major archaeological and criminal investigation, even though the crimes are over a century old. The FBI might get involved because of the interstate nature of victims. Media attention will be intense." Marcus nodded, understanding his quiet country life was about to become very complicated. But looking up at the clear Montana sky, where spirits had disappeared, he knew it was worth it. Clara and her fellow victims were finally at peace, and their stories would finally be told. Dr. Medina handed Marcus her card. "I want to help you through this process. What you've done here, what you've committed to doing, it's remarkable. Most people would have just filled in that basement and tried to forget about it." As Dr. Medina and Jake drove away, Marcus stood alone on his property for the first time since discovering the basement. But he didn't feel alone. He felt part of something much larger than himself. Connected to the land's history and the people who had suffered there, the barn stood quiet and peaceful in moonlight. No longer a place of horror, but a monument to human capacity for both evil and redemption. Marcus had bought it for $1 thinking he was getting a bargain. Instead, he had become guardian of one of Montana history's most important discoveries, and the instrument through which dozens of forgotten souls had finally found their peace. 6 months later, Marcus stood in his transformed barn, watching a team of forensic archaeologists carefully excavate the final section of the basement walls. What had begun as his private discovery had become one of the most significant historical investigations in Montana's history, drawing experts from across the country and capturing international media attention. The excavation had yielded the remains of 38 victims, along with personal artifacts that helped identify many of them. Dr. Medina had been right about the descendants' genealogists. Working with the investigation, had located living family members for more than half of the victims. The reunions had been emotional and healing, giving closure to families who had passed down stories of mysteriously disappeared ancestors for generations. James Morton's great-great-granddaughter, Patricia Morton Williams, had traveled from Ohio to see where her ancestor had died. She brought with her a family Bible that contained James's name and the date he had left for Montana, never to be heard from again. When Patricia held the tools that had been buried with James's remains, she wept tears of both sorrow and relief. "We always wondered," she told Marcus. "My great-grandmother used to say that James wouldn't have just disappeared without sending word. She knew something terrible must have happened to him." Similar scenes played out with other families. Robert Chen's descendants from San Francisco brought traditional Chinese burial materials and performed ceremonies to honor their ancestors' spirit. Miguel Santos's relatives came from Texas. 3 generations of a family that had always honored Miguel's memory despite never knowing his fate. Investigation had also uncovered evidence that Silas Blackwood's crimes extended far beyond his own property. Clara's journal contained references to other locations. Authorities were now investigating several sites across Montana and surrounding states. Silas appeared to have been part of a network of criminals who preyed on travelers and immigrants during the late 1800s. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery had been Clara herself. Additional research revealed that Clara Mendez had been a schoolteacher from New Mexico who had married Silas believing he was a legitimate rancher. When she discovered the truth about his activities, she had risked her life trying to help his victims, ultimately paying with her own life for her compassion. Clara's story had captured public imagination worldwide. She had become a symbol of courage and compassion, someone who had stood up against evil even when it cost her everything. A memorial fund established in her name was raising money to help families of missing persons. Across the American West, the basement itself had been completely excavated and was now being converted into a proper memorial site. The original stone walls would be preserved, along with the iron chains and shackles, but the space would be transformed into a place of remembrance rather than horror. Plaques would bear the names and stories of all the victims, ensuring they would never be forgotten again. Marcus had found himself at the center of a media storm, but he had handled the attention with grace and humility. He consistently redirected interviews away from himself and toward the victims and their families. When television crews came to film documentaries, Marcus always emphasized that the real heroes of the story were Clara and the people who had suffered in that basement. The property itself had been designated as a historical landmark, which came with both responsibilities and benefits. The state of Montana had provided funding for the memorial construction and ongoing maintenance. Tour groups would eventually be allowed to visit the site, with all proceeds going toward missing persons investigations and victim advocacy programs. Marcus's original dream of a quiet country workshop had evolved into something far more meaningful. The barn now housed not only his woodworking tools, but also a research library and visitor center, dedicated to the victims of frontier-era crimes. He had become an unofficial historian and advocate, working with law enforcement agencies to investigate other cold cases from the Tri-State period. The farmhouse had been fully renovated, and now served as Marcus's home and as temporary housing for visiting researchers and family members. He had never married, but he no longer felt alone on the property. Instead of being haunted by tragic spirits, the land now felt blessed by the memory of people who had found peace. Dr. Medina had become a frequent collaborator and close friend. Her academic research on the case had been published in multiple journals, and she was writing a book about the investigation. She often visited the property to continue her research and to help train other paranormal investigators in proper archaeological and historical methods. On quiet evenings, Marcus would walk through his property and remember that first day when he had thought he was getting the bargain of a lifetime for just $1. In a way, he had been right, though not in the way he had expected. He had gained something far more valuable than land. He had found his life's purpose. The memorial was scheduled to open to the public the following month. On the anniversary of Clara's death, representatives from dozens of families would be present, along with tribal leaders from several Native American communities whose ancestors had also suffered during that violent period of Western expansion. Marcus had been asked to speak at the dedication ceremony, and he had been working on his remarks for weeks. He wanted to find words that would honor the victims, celebrate Clara's courage, and remind people that individual actions could make a difference even against seemingly insurmountable evil. As he stood in the barn that evening, looking at the memorial plaques bearing the names of 38 men and one remarkable woman, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had come to Montana looking for a simple dream of rural peace. Instead, he had found himself caring for the memory of people who had died long before he was born, and discovering that some responsibilities transcended time itself. The dollar he had paid for this property had been the best investment of his life. Not because of any financial return, but because it had connected him to something eternal and meaningful. Clara Blackwood and the men who had died with her were no longer trapped in that basement, but their stories would live on forever, reminding future generations that every human life has value and that courage and compassion can triumph even in the darkest circumstances. Marcus had bought a barn for $1 and discovered that some things are truly priceless.